Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Rocky Recap. This is for Saturday, May 14th, 2022, and it starts out a little bit unusually in that there's dead air for several minutes when Rocky's show is supposed to come on, and then it cuts to a commercial break, and I'm wondering at this point, is Rocky off the air? Is he late? Has, God forbid, something happened to him? Or has his congressional rival candidate asked for equal time? And I don't think 94.9 is about to give 2 hours a week to a Democratic candidate on the radio. And so usually when people in radio run for office, they go off air at least for the duration of the campaign. So I'm wondering all of these things during this several minutes of dead air and then commercials, and I hear his theme song come on at 8:12, so he is on air for whatever reason. Things get delayed, it happens, whatever. And he starts to talk about how spring is coming and how it's amazing how in just 1 week you have the difference between putting your heat on and not needing it at all. And in my position, I went from having a fire every morning to having the AC on in just a couple of days. So yeah, it's a huge change. And he talks about how life is coming back to this area. And he talks about how he sees plants in stores and how it's so great, and he wants to see people buy plants and make their yards beautiful. It talks about how in Italy everyone has lemon trees, and that's a little harder in this climate, but believe it or not, you can get away with growing a lot of different types of fruit trees in this area. And that's something I'll probably be discussing on the main podcast probably within the next couple of weeks, because it's a really important subject to me. And I sent Rocky an email, as I do from time to time. And as always, the emails that I send to him are very polite and trying to reach out an olive branch. Like, as much as this guy seems to hate me, I've always just tried to have a dialogue with him. And you know, people can disagree, and people can disagree ferociously, but I don't think it has to be a vicious thing unless things, get very extreme. And we're just people trying to have a conversation. That's not relevant to this topic. And so I send him an email with the headline, "Plants Are God's Gift." And the body of the text is, "I heard your segment on gardening, and I'm glad you brought it up. As life returns to this area in full force, we can help bring more beauty and abundance to our own areas. I'm also happy you brought up the lemon trees in Italy. Even in New England, we have dozens of fruit trees that can thrive, including many you might not expect, even figs. And with our food prices squeezing us common folks, it's so important that we bring more food sourcing back locally. I hope to see neighborhoods overflowing with food soon. I've been giving out food-bearing trees and doing our yearly fundraiser to help boost that effort. Have a great day." So, this, I guess, is another one of those nasty emails that Rocky always talks about people sending him, because he says he doesn't reply to nasty emails, and I guess this must be another one, because, boy, it's been a couple days now and still no reply. Anyway, he talks about having gone to a Christian concert the night before, and, good for him. I'm glad he's seeing media that makes him happy. I think he said it was up in Providence, but not super relevant. He comes back and from break at this point and talks about how Lee Elsey can respond to calls and text and Google, and how people like us are just amateurs, and he's referring to the weekend broadcasters. And I had the same feeling when I was on Lee's show trying to live post citations of my points on his daily comment thread for the show. Like, that's not easy. Anyway, we can all aspire to better, but boy, it looks tough. Anyway, he says that everyone wants to come to America because of the Constitution, and says that it's a remarkable human achievement. And I have long maintained that I think the Constitution was a noble effort that had some shortcomings because, humans have a hard time coming up with a perfect document, and I've long advocated that we need to explore how to form what they might call a more perfect union, because that's what we're all pursuing. We're pursuing as close to perfection as we can achieve, because we ideally are trying to constantly increase our standard of living and our standard of liberty. Both of those seem to be dropping, and it seems the Constitution hasn't been able to protect us. So perhaps there's some way of figuring out how to make sure those rights are protected, because what we have now doesn't seem to be making it work. He says that America was founded under God. Rocky probably doesn't remember that under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance June 14th, 1954, and In God We Trust was added to money on July 11th, 1955 by Dwight D. Eisenhower. Fun fact, former fellow Bircher-inspired Weekend host Lori Hopkins Cavanaugh regularly called Eisenhower a secret communist. I'll leave that one there and remind you that the Republicans shunned the Birchers in the Reagan era for being a bunch of conspiratorial wingnuts. And so now we have another call coming in. I think this was Jim from Lisbon, but my notes have a blank here. So Rocky talks then about how Italy is a republic founded on labor. He's contrasting that with what he sees as America being founded on God and Christianity, despite the fact that we codified separation of church and state, and there were quite a few papers in that era where people tried to have a more secular approach despite being Christians. And yes, you can do both. Anyway, that's a big involved subject, and there's a lot of interesting debate to happen there. And again, it is beyond the purview of, at the very least, this episode. So he says Italy is a republic founded on labor, and he says that is because the majority of the people who fought fascism were socialists and communists. And this is, again, interesting because he referred to Mussolini as a communist. So it seems like, again, he's mixing up his terms here, or at the very least using them with whatever political convenience happens. So, with the help of the Allies, according to him, they got rid of the king by cheating in the elections. And if you don't know about the fights between the left and the right in Italy, it's a huge subject with a wild history. And for a taste of how crazy these times were, the era between 1960 and the late 1980s is still known as the years of lead. Anyway, Rocky says we can do this being, changing and taking the country back, if we speak our opinions legally and peacefully. He's very, very adamant about this legally and peacefully approach to doing things. And I'm glad that he has principles. And he talks as an example about how Patrick Sasser headed the No Tolls movement. In Connecticut, a governor ran on the promise of not having any tolls, and shortly thereafter had a serious change of heart, and a lot of people were rightly very upset. The tolls were incredibly unpopular, and through a multi-partisan effort, largely led by Republicans, but mostly just common folks that didn't feel like having more legal living expenses shoved down their throat. Quite a few protests and large rallies and pressure on the state from a lot of directions have us in a situation where there are no tolls today. And he talks about the rally in Norwich where he first came up, and that's actually where I met Rocky for the first time. And we spoke at length about how the people are beaten down and how the Yellow Vest movement that was still raging at the time is an example of how common people being pressured by governments that don't care about them can create serious uprisings. Anyway, we also spoke about my aid group, and he said he'd like to have me on. Unfortunately, that never happened. I guess because he decided that our partisan leaning made our aid work invalid. That's okay, of course. It's his show, and I'm not his boss. That's the big man upstairs. And he says that teaching kids stuff that they don't need to know is child abuse. Presumably, he's referring to sex ed for the kids, and while the age that should start can definitely be debated, I think it's important that folks know how their bodies work before they start using them. There's a reason states without sex ed tend to have much higher rates of teen pregnancy. This isn't hard. I think there's a reasonable balance to be found here, where the needs of people can be balanced with some folks' concerns over timing. Anyway, I happen to be of the opinion that good outcomes are most important. So Rocky goes to a break and comes back with a song where the chorus is, I don't care if I leave a legacy, I don't care if they remember me, only Jesus. And, that's nice sentiment. Rocky says that, this song really sort of encapsulates how he feels. And if that's true, that's a very noble thing. There's not really much to see here. The man is a devout Christian. Nothing out of the ordinary for his discussions. He says he's going to play more songs by this band, and gets back on the subject of saying we have a means of changing things because of the founding fathers. Rocky talks about how our founding fathers, it's hard to believe, according to him, withstood far lesser abuses before they decided to make a change, and they had to rebel. And according to Rocky, nowadays we don't need to rebel. Thanks to our founding fathers, we have a means of changing our circumstances. And that, to me, seems a little naive. But anyway, he says that if the people say no to the legislature, that they will listen. I would say tell that to the Iraq War protesters. Some of the largest protests in human history were part of the anti-war movement in that era, and it was a lot more than just protests, too. And power didn't listen. Power only listens if the stakes are low or if the issue isn't that important. If you really want to change the character of power, you can't use the tools power gives you to make change. That's not how this works. That's not how this has ever worked. But if your only experience with history is the sanitized version of history that the system allows you to be taught, then you could be fooled into believing that reform is an effective way of making power concede and raising the standard of living in more than just a cosmetic way that will placate you long enough for the system to outmaneuver you another way and plunge the standard right back down. He says we should get back to the basics and teach people how to do things in government. And, Rocky is a man of faith, not just in God, but in the institution of government. And that is not a faith that I share. He says we're letting them get away with things that we don't agree with. And he says that this country belongs to us. And I would counter, no, it doesn't. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I'm so grateful that the grassroots right wing doesn't know how change works. Brian from Quaker Hill calls in, and he says that educate comes from the Latin word educare, meaning to draw out, and he thanks Rocky for educating the people. And my reaction is, yikes. Yikes. It's things like this that make me deeply concerned about the direction of the country. When someone spreads demonstrable mistruths by ignorance or by malice, and people say that, they're grateful for being educated by them, that's a really bad dynamic, and it's very worrisome that this sort of thing is an opinion that is held by actually a great number of people. Anyway, he talks about how we're all so busy working 2 jobs so we can survive, and all these people in government are just working to install their will against the people. And I would say, yeah, I mean, maybe that's because we're being thrown deeper and deeper into a system that subjugates everything to profit motive and relies on crushing those it needs to operate. Maybe it's the capitalism that you stand for that is the reason you have to work 2 jobs. That is the reason you have to struggle to survive. That is the reason that you don't have time for political engagement, because you're so busy trying to bail a sinking ship. A caller advertises the new movie, The F Word, and apparently that word is father, which apparently is canceled. I don't know. You'd think if I'm so deep on the left, I would have heard about this by now, but oh well. Peter from Southampton calls in, and he believes we are living in a country where the media has taken a person's desire or even the capacity for questioning. And the answer is yes. I've spoken about this for a long time. We live in a corporate-controlled media bubble, and as a result, our desire and ability to resist has been largely neutralized.
And one of the reasons I went into that area is that I have a real concern that in terms of the media, we really are, through the mass media in general, and I want to congratulate C-SPAN for being an exception to that rule, I think we don't really get a real glimpse of American reality on the CBSs and the NBCs. And I think when we talk about why we are where we are today as a country, we have candidates for the Democratic and Republican parties never seriously debating, in my view, the real issues facing our country. I think the television and the television industry plays a really important part in preventing serious debate about the major issues facing our country. As a candidate for office, for example, you know that when you get on television, you have 30 seconds to articulate your point of view. You know that you're dependent upon 30-second ads. And I think it is absolutely imperative, if we talk about bringing back a sense of democracy to this country where people don't just sit and watch other people, but feel that this is their country and that they can shape it. We've got to make radical changes in the television industry and demand that they deal with the important issues facing our society.
That's at the root of my critique of the Constitution, but Rocky would rather mischaracterize me and then agree with this caller, making more or less the same point. Here's some perspective. The richest guy on the Forbes 2021 list owns the Washington Post. The second owns Twitter. The third owns Facebook. 5 and 6 started Google. 4 and 9 started Microsoft. And 10 owns Bloomberg News. So in a world where oligarchs control the flow of information, thinking that they won't use that to their advantage is naive and not grounded in history. And this corrosive dynamic is not protected against in the Constitution and subverts our most key protections of the Constitution. What is the point of your First Amendment freedom of speech if the only things you've learned how to say are corporate-sanctioned talking points? What is the value of your Second Amendment if you're too inculcated into the system to ever dream of taking up arms against it? Those are our 2 biggest protections, and we're trained out of having any desire to exercise either of them in any meaningful way. Those were put there to preserve our right to threaten power, and power has removed our desire to threaten it. Anyway, that is why I view the Constitution as a failed effort. It has been subverted, and the founders could not have imagined such an inversion of the principles once used to guarantee freedom being used to erase it. We have the caller now talking about how New York mayors are often Democrats, and why, if they're so unpopular, why don't people just vote for Republicans? And this is a tired talking point that's almost on the verge of a bad faith argument, and it shows how folks don't understand the political opposition. If you don't like being shot in the leg, why don't you vote for being shot in the face? Hard pass. He says we need to question everything, but he says, I don't question you, Rocky. Said it before, and I'll say it again. Yikes. He really said that without a shred of irony or any sort of self-awareness to what he just said. Which is unfortunate, because if he did even a little homework of questioning Rocky, he'd see Rocky's credibility relies on people not fact-checking him. Rocky says, in the next point, there's not one scientific proof that evolution ever took place, so why are we accepting it? Well, you could say the exact same thing of creationism, and we actually notice evolution in real time, so we can conclusively prove that it does exist in the present. Does that specifically mean that it's the origin of man? Well, obviously that's harder to conclusively prove because it's in the past, so we can't observe it directly. Only the evidence that is left behind. Can we conclusively prove most things in history? Not really. But most of those things are still taught as fact because we are in a world where we use relative certainty backed by known facts to guide our actions and analysis. Without that, you're either blindly swinging and hoping you hit something, or just sitting down too afraid to miss. The caller talks about baby formula and says it's only being talked about on Fox News. I don't think it's only happening on Fox News, and this guy does admit that maybe he's just missed it. I hear about it on all sorts of different media entities, but I'm also not a TV guy, so perhaps my sample group is a little bit skewed. With that said, Rocky talks about how it's interesting that media entities didn't used to all say the same thing, and now they are. So, yeah, Rocky, again, this capitalism that you so shamelessly promote is why all of these media agencies sound the same. They've all been bought up because that sort of consolidation is allowed under capitalism in the name of freedom and free business. And so what happens when your pursuit of your legally allowed rights to do business start to erode the freedom and even the conceptual framework that allows for freedom to exist? What happens when a business using their freedom to speak about their business and advocate for themselves starts to undermine the freedom of people, and many people? What's more valuable there? To me, the answer is pretty clear, but maybe to you it's a little bit different. But either way, I think it's very hard to imagine that there isn't a danger toward freedom here if you allow non-human entities to have freedom, or if you allow for certain entities to have a disproportionate impact upon the system. That really starts to allow for an oligarchy to form, and we start to have the same structures that we were trying to get rid of in the revolution or the labor movement or the civil rights movement or any number of times that people have challenged power. So that's not a good situation. Anyway, the next thing Rocky goes on to is he goes back to talking about how saying, no one has ever given any proof ever that evolution has happened. And again, I think Rocky is misstating the facts here. Certainly you can never 100% prove almost anything about the past, but the preponderance of evidence seems to very strongly indicate that at least some form of evolution is pretty likely. And so rather than have that sort of nuanced take, he uses a more extreme take in order to paint this as a black and white issue. And the facts of the matter is that it's not a black and white issue. But here we are. Rocky says they want us to believe that, everything started 200 billion years ago. And again, he's misstating the facts. Most people believe that the universe has been around for about 14.5 billion years. Best evidence currently suggests that our solar system has been around in the vicinity of like 5 or 6 billion years. Earth itself has been around for about 4.5. Life has been around, I think, for about 1 billion or so. And, started out with the ocean, and moved on to the land from there, blah, 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 blah. Millions and millions and hundreds of millions of years are passing by. And the theory goes that depending on how you measure, about 2.2 million years ago, we started to have the hominids that are the family of species that we are said to have come from, started to look a lot more like the Homo sapiens that we know today. And so how does a creationist justify all of these seemingly in-between species happening in chronological order, especially when we know that species today adapt and evolve to their changing circumstances in current observable real time? it stands to reason that perhaps that evolution has occurred with us as well. But again, we're not talking nuance here. We're not talking serious analysis. We're talking narrative. He talks about one of his favorite ways of illustrating his point is talking about getting some glass and some copper wire and some aluminum and expecting it to machine itself into a phone. That is not what anyone is arguing here, and ironically, that is essentially what the creationist point is arguing, of this nothing was just created spontaneously. He seems to act as if the evolutionary perspective is the magical one, but the one that relies on what you might consider magic is the creationist perspective. Now, does that mean that it's not true? Not necessarily. Magic is just a word we use to describe a phenomenon that we don't understand. And he says that's what they want us to believe, and it's wicked, and that's my opinion. And I can think of a lot of things in this world that are wicked. I don't think that pondering the origin of our species and looking at the fossil record and drawing reasonable but possibly incorrect conclusions is wicked. I think that's natural human curiosity to understand our origins. But what do I know? A caller phones in and talks about how churches are asking people to sign a covenant to build up the church and to obey leaders. And to his credit, Rocky rejects this and says his allegiance is to his king, Jesus Christ. Some religions contend that Christ is the son of the king, but again, this isn't a theology podcast. But she thanks him very much for telling her to say that if it's not in the scriptures, that she won't do it. I missed this next segment because I had to talk to my client. During this part, I was drywalling in a closet, listening to the Rocky Radio Show and taking as diligent notes as I could. And I had to go tell the client I had to move on for the day and allow the drywall putty to dry while I did the rest of my stuff. And as I come back, I hear Rocky's advertising a movie tonight. Rocky does this a lot. He likes to advertise events for his Rocky Brigade, his fan club, to go to so they can all sort of experience this ideological unfolding together. So Robin from QCA calls in. For the record, QCA is the organization that held the rally on October 23rd that I met some of those people at, who I am still friends with to this day. She says that QCA goes to all the boards and meetings in the area, and Rocky refers to it as the Quinnipiac Citizens Alliance. It's actually Quinnebog, not particularly important, but just in the event that there ends up being a Quinnipiac Citizens Alliance at some point, I just want to make sure we have that clear. And Rocky brings up the 23rd and says that the event, happened without any sort of incidents. It was clean and proper and had beautiful security. And, he was the headliner at the event other than Marjorie Taylor Greene, so I'm sure he felt was very well taken care of there. And he said it felt like he really belonged there. And I'm sure he did. He was surrounded by a lot of people that are strong believers in the ideology that he espouses. So yeah, absolutely he belongs there. And they both explain how they're both very proud of America and that they're gonna fix it. The caller asks how the race is going, and Rocky says he doesn't want to say much on air because there are restrictions, but we need to stand against tyranny. And he gets back into this again, saying it's hard to believe that the colonials took much less abuse and they rebelled, but we don't have to rebel because this thing is ours. And it isn't. It isn't. It should be, but it isn't. Paul from Norwich calls in and asks when he can get a campaign sign. And he says that it's shameful that a country as great as ours is being overwhelmed. And he thinks that the politicians have been paid off and we need to make immigration easier. This is Rocky speaking about overwhelming the borders with immigrants, and he believes that politicians are being bribed in this situation. And he, to his credit, wants to make immigration easier in order to maybe undercut the flow of illegal immigration. Unbeknownst to him, he has expressed a left talking point, but broken clocks, I suppose. He also brings up again how Switzerland has been at peace for 700 years. Well, Switzerland is essentially a bank surrounded by mountains that hoards everyone's money, so it's easy to be at peace if you're holding everyone's cash. And he says that to these evildoers that, like, he doesn't care if they're nice people. He doesn't care if they have PhDs. And the caller talks about how on the 27th and 28th in Switzerland, something has to do with the WHO, and they are saying they can confiscate your cash and confiscate your houses. This really sounds like an InfoWars kind of style conspiracy theory, but I haven't heard about it. Certainly something that sounds like people in that world have been saying for a very long time, and it's no more or less believable now, in my personal opinion. Rocky says we should never give our sovereignty away, and the caller reminds him that this process started with Obama, apparently, which again does seem like it has InfoWars kind of fingerprints on it, because they were really big into making him into some sort of conspiratorial monster. And I certainly do see Obama in a very harshly critical light, but not so much the conspiratorial angle that is talked about in the right more often. And then Rocky advertises Rabbi Jonathan Cahn has a movie called The Harbingers of Things to Come. Apparently it's on Mystic May 19th. Goes to a break and comes back advertising another fundraiser. This is the Skills USA Pasta Supper. Mary from East Lyme calls in and refers to Peter calling in earlier and says, "You want to know why the good ones don't speak out?" You know, she's referring to why good Democrats don't speak out against what is happening. And Rocky says, well, Manchin and Sinema were good Democrats, which is, to me, a little nauseating to say. But anyway, they spoke out and they gummed up some proceedings that the rest of the so-called bad Democrats were trying to do. And Rocky brings out how they were very badly persecuted. And they both say that good Democrats are afraid to speak out. But it also doesn't give you any excuse. It's a little ironic that basically this same argument happens with police accountability. They have this sort of idea of why don't the good police speak out? Well, they're afraid to, potentially. And does that give them an excuse? A lot of people will say, no, it doesn't give them an excuse. They should still speak out. But a lot of times when police within the institution try to change the institution from the inside, they're marginalized. Sometimes they're fired. Sometimes worse. I saw a video from Florida that I think was about 6 months ago, but it recently came out. Body cam footage of a sergeant or supervisor abusing someone who was handcuffed in the back of a vehicle and yelling at him. And a female officer came up from behind him and tapped his shoulder to kind of pull him back a little bit and say, like, hey, calm down. He spins around and grabs her by the neck and slams her against a car and says, you know, don't you ever fucking touch me.
You play what the you gotta do, man. You gonna mace me, mace me. Look at you wanna play you ever get disrespectful with my officers, I will remove your soul from your body. Do it, man. Do what you gotta do. Don't ever me again. Sir. Get the
Sir.
And says we're going to talk after this is over, and directs all of his subordinates to turn off their body cameras. So that's not great, but that's what happens when good people speak out, which again makes you wonder, maybe this whole system is so bad that it puts people in that situation. You would think that good people should be willing to speak out. The saying goes, speak the truth even if your voice shakes. Anyway, they talk about how Democrats went off the deep end in a local election and someone went independent rather than being Democrat. The Republicans endorsed them and they won. And that's sort of this attempt for the Republicans to try to court some of the independent vote, because given that they are a minority rule party, by which I mean they are not the majority of the population, but they have finagled the rules in such a way that allows them to exercise power with the legitimacy of law. They're going to have to try to find some independent support soon, because the Republican base, in many ways, is quite literally dying off. She talked about how Romney is a turncoat, that's for sure, and then talks about how she got a fundraising envelope from Liz Cheney, and she returned it with a letter saying that she's a turncoat and gave her all of her complaints in that letter that she sent back. And she says, that's speaking up. I'm sorry, no it isn't. It's okay to exert your power according to her, but you just exerted your impotent rage, and that letter went from a low-level sorter right into the trash. Complaints about politicians getting a paid Peloton membership is her next thing. And again, I'm not one to stand for politicians and their corruption, but like, pick your issue. There's so many things that are wrong with politicians, and Rocky wishes her good luck and thanks her for sending that letter to Liz Cheney. And we go back in again to this subject and says we all should do that. Send a message. And boy, again, am I glad the right wing has no idea how change works at the grassroots level. How does she think that sending all of these letters is going to do anything meaningful for this fundraising effort? Speaking truth to power doesn't do much of anything, and it has a very poor historical record of working, especially if what you're speaking to power is an opinion rather than a demonstrable truth. They're just going to throw the letter away and pander to someone else. Rocky talks about Peter Kuprak's funeral. He was a frequent caller to the Lee Elsey Show and the Rocky Show. Apparently he was Rocky's next-door neighbor, and he passed away pretty recently. He was an older guy, so it wasn't a huge surprise, but it was very sudden. And I guess his wife, Bonnie, was very distraught. Of course, you would be losing your partner for so many years. Peter and I didn't talk much. We disagreed, obviously, on quite a few things, but we never had much of a real argument. Yeah, I mean, anytime someone that you talk to, even just a little bit, dies, it's not a happy time. And a lot of people in the local radio community are sad about it because he was well liked. So Jim from Lisbon calls in and talks about how our early leaders, apparently Governor Winthrop specifically, had Governor's Island as a place to pray because our leaders used to be men of God. And having a private island to pray sounds really obnoxious to me, but okay. Sort of sounds like how Jesus talked about people who make a show out of their prayer are hypocrites and he will not recognize them. But what do I know? The caller also talks about how Swiss people apparently can't buy stock in the corporations they work for. Only unaffiliated citizens can do that. And that sounds like regulations on capitalism. So good luck trying to pass that in America. They will call it communism and socialism and every other name in the book. But again, the average person is more open to regulating capitalism than they're trained to believe, because it's just an intuitive truth that if you're going to have this nightmare system, you need to put so many layers of protections in to make sure it doesn't destroy everything, that almost it makes you wonder, maybe we need a different system if we have to put so many extra features onto this that it doesn't murder everyone. And of course, they talk about the Great Replacement again, nothing particularly new here. They go to break and come back, and Lee from Waterford calls in. And he says, you need to know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So hard to know the truth, according to him, when the alphabet stations and TV and social media sites are putting out all of these lies. And he talks about how consulting the Bible is the way to find the truth. And if you have the love of God in your heart, you can discern what's true and real. And all I have to say to that is, ouch to Rocky, because he seems to have a very hard time discerning what is true and real by his constant factual errors and failures of analysis. So are we saying he doesn't have the love of God in his heart? Because that's sad for him, I suppose. Anyway, just pointless thing to ponder, but interesting. Apparently, Rocky, when he was in Italy, got really screwed over by the Italian system when he went out there to help his sister. Apparently, the judge delayed some sort of proceedings that he flew out there to do, and he was very mad about this. And he went out to the storm to vent, and he saw 2 rainbows in a ship pretty similar to the one that he used to sail around the Adriatic out in the distance. And he says, that's why I praise you in the storm. I think when he came back from break, he played one of those Christian songs that had that line in it. And he says why this song is so important to him. And he says he begged the Almighty for forgiveness. And he was run up to this cliff to curse and shout and scream. And he was presented with a sign that allowed him to feel peace. And he said, forgive me. And Rocky finishes the show by saying, be with good people. Don't be with bad people. Be with people that nourish you. But if you judge bad people, which apparently he does, by them not agreeing with you, then that's kind of depressing. That to me sounds like insulate yourself. I often try to challenge myself to be with people that I am trained to believe are bad. And I found that really pays off in life. For having unexpected connections and unexpected friendships that people like Rocky will never have, because he won't go around people that he feels are against his beliefs. I don't know. Maybe I'm just a naive person believing in the power of friendliness to create space for a different world. Anyway, thanks so much for listening, and barring Rocky's congressional rival demanding equal time, we'll see him on the air again next week. So, have a great day.
I eat meat and drive trucks and shoot guns and don't trust in the federal government to solve our problems. You might think I'm joking, but I'm not a Republican. Call me when you're president.